Have you checked the children? You're a little mad sometimes.
Hi, I'm Chucky. Wanna play?
Sometimes that is better.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Benvenidos, hellacious, hedonistic heathens, and welcome once more to my coverage of Mr. Clive with none other than Barker at the Moon. Yes, that's right, and this is actually completing a 6 installment bit of coverage about none other than what basically put Homie's name on the map, and rightfully so, talking the 6th and final volume of the Books of Blood today. And yes, quite a journey in these last, over half a year that I've been working on this particular segment, Barker at the Moon. It's been a lot of fun, and I'm not certain if I'm immediately going to jump into Damnation Game, or maybe talk to Tapping the Vein comic book adaptions, which are really dope that I recently acquired myself, but we are talking about, as I said, the 6th and final installment of the Books of Blood. And I will preface this right off the bat by saying that I'm not going to be talking about The Last Illusion here because of the fact that it is the most well-known from this collection. It is the one that was actually made into Clive Barker's written and directed 1995 film Lord of Illusions. I will at least give some very brief thoughts on the fact that I was surprised at how different it was as far as just keeping it very Manhattan-centric and with like the whole like corpse sitting and all that different stuff. I was thinking of, I think it was The Vigil from last year that I liked so very much. That was a great horror film. But nonetheless, that is a video for a different time because of the fact that there is a short story that he actually put out in a collection the following year in '87, because this was '86, this particular volume of the Books of Blood, the 6th and final installment, and it was a short story called Lost Souls. And if you just Google Clive Barker, Lost Souls, that's another uncollected, ironically enough, Harry D'Amour short story that actually ties in with the blind elderly black woman that we get in the Scarlet Gospels and some of that interesting sort of lore. So definitely one to check out, but that's going to be a separate little video that I'm hoping that perhaps myself and Robert the Wolfman here on the Horror Show can actually put together, where we talk about just the continuing adventures of Harry D'Amour, because I know he pops up briefly, I believe, in the Great and Secret Show and some other different stuff. So Harry is one of the most beloved and renowned, I'd say, aside from Pinhead, you know. But so anyway, The Last Illusion was that particular story. So just to preface, I'm not going to be discussing that one in any particular depth today. However, I am going to be talking about the fact that it interestingly bookends, like, when I was first covering this, you know, and so Books of Blood, when the aforementioned, like, you know, title proper, there is that Book of Blood short story that starts out the first volume of the initial collection, and he, interestingly enough, ties things back together, and as far as, like, loose ends and, like, what happened to that character of that boy, so to speak, and, just the damage after being so carved up, and I'm trying not to get super spoilery with these stories, but it is a sequel to that very first story from the very first volume, and for clarification, the Book of Blood, a postscript on Jerusalem Street, and I'm going to be actually working in reverse fashion, similar as to, I believe it was volume 3, where I was talking about like my favorites of the stories and just kind of working my way back. But yeah, on Jerusalem Street is very interesting because it does work as that aforementioned postscript, and it's about a collector that has sent in, like, kind of an assassin of sorts to track down the boy who had all of those carvings after the mockery of the dead and acting like he was some sort of medium and, you know, obviously passing himself off as something that he was not, and then the repercussions were the fact that said mockery was, you know, it was returned tenfold in a rather nasty fashion, and the fact that the wounds are still described as still being tender by said narrator and to, you know, the assassin that is coming to basically for a collector down in South America, if I remember correctly. Yeah, wants to kill him and harvest said stuff, and there is, in turn, repercussion for that sort of thing. And it's very odd because that boy, our shyster of sorts from the very first story from Volume 1, he now talks in a third person, and so you can definitely tell that he has just been so savaged by just, you know, said otherworldly vengeance, and yeah, he's kind of a hollow shell of his former self. And so that's the shortest of all of the stories. I want to say it's only like 10 or 15 pages. It is very, very brief, but very effective in its own said regard. And so big fan of that one. Nice postscript, nice like little epilogue of sorts that gives that connective tissue, and you know how visceral Clive can be. And so yeah, big fan of that one. And aforementioned The Last Illusion, which is the longest of the stories if I'm not mistaken. It's the only one on the audiobook because I always read and then I also listen as well. And so that was the only one that was broken up into 2 separate, bits and pieces, so it was like 2.5 hours in the listen process, if I remember correctly. So it's definitely the longest of the stories, and so as I will be leapfrogging and not discussing in depth The Last Illusion, despite the fact that it did have some very interesting bits, the fact that Swan called himself the Great Pretender, the fact that he also, with a note that he leaves to his wife, he's like, you know how critics can be, they wait until you can't fight back, then they start the character assassinations. It's kind of similar to things that Steve, actually, my beloved El Rey, Stephen King, has talked about how, everyone is a critic and how earlier in his career before, Shawshank and Misery and things like that, King was savaged as being like kind of a schlock. And I would imagine that, Clive to even write something like that probably had some similar sort of adversaries in the press, so to speak, going after him, and the fact that his stuff is so violently visceral and nasty a lot of the time, and depraved is probably one of the most utilized words, especially for Clive's 80s output. I feel like he did, as he veered more into fantasy later in his career, at least from what I understand, because I haven't read a lot of 90s Clive, but it's very much the fact that, yeah, he tried to just not go for that sort of nastiness. He tried to expand and get more fantastical and get more, diverse with his ideas, as opposed to just trying to go for that shock factor, which was so big, in the days of Thatcher in the 80s and whatnot, and the video nasties and all those different things. But so yes, Last Illusion will be discussed with Lost Souls and maybe a cross-examination of the Lord of Illusions film, which I think we have talked about here on the Horror Show at one particular point, but, when you've been doing this as many years as, Cecil and I and Marcia and the rest of the crew have, sometimes you're like, did we do a video about that? So you think for a second. But, yeah, man. Now we get to a story that, shout out once again to Robert the Wolfman, and the fact that he had talked about this particular story various times, and it is called, I'm just trying to make sure I don't butcher it, Twilight at the Towers. And so this is one that I actually am glad that I had not read a little synopsis about initially, because this shit's about werewolves, yeah, without getting like too into it, or at least like a genetically engineered like sort of thing, but also in said 80s fashion, it is very much set on the backdrop of a divided Berlin, a divided Germany, and that Soviet KGB sort of influence that was so heavily prevalent, especially during that aspect of the Iron Curtain being up. And yet there was just still little murmurings about the fact that there was, just showing splintering, cracks as far as the sympathies and so on and so forth goes. But so it's about a British agent and a defecting KGB guy and how they form this kind of, I guess friendship is a good way to put it, but it's not until much later in the story, after there is a murder of a person, where you start to really figure out what this is actually about. And so I guess that is kind of a mild spoiler for me to say that it's in the description, but I must admit that as I was reading and then later even listening to it again, I was like, I feel like until like the back half of this story, it is relatively dull in some ways, It's very much about just the intrigue and the unraveling of the mystery, and if the mystery is spoiled for you in the synopsis, which I guess I just did by saying that this is, about a, creature transformative sort of storytelling, then I'm glad that I didn't read that beforehand, or if Robert had mentioned it, I'm glad that I forgot it, but it's not really until like the back half where you start to really pull back the layers about secret societies and military sort of weapons programs and like human transformative weapons. And there is a really cool line actually that I wanted to make mention of. So there is talk by this particular scientist, government sort of dude, about wolves in sheep's clothing, which obviously makes sense. And then how our main protagonist in this, how he is aware of his condition, but therapy holds the leash. I thought that was a very interesting little bit. And then also, a point that they come back to multiple times in this. It's mentioned early in the story, and then they kind of tread their way back toward it near the end. A man who did not believe himself lost was in fact lost. And that's something that I can most definitely ruminate about, because of the fact that if you are in some sort of sense of denial of sorts, I guess, I'm not sure, man, but that is a phrase that most definitely just called to me and that I found a very profound sort of resonance within is that you have to be aware of your surroundings and not kind of in said, essence of denial. You have to just say, I am kind of at the mercy of situations, and that are all too often outside of my control. And just I don't know. It's interestingly profound in that particular regard. But once again, for me, until there's some biblical passages that are mentioned at the very end of the story, and I'm just like, damn, hitting the resonance there, and also giving some clarification about it kind of put said scripture into a different sense of context for me, being raised Reformed Baptist and all of that different stuff. So yeah, I was into this story. I didn't love it though, as I was clarifying, and Robert is the werewolf dude, and so I will leave this one to him. This one would most definitely, with an adequate budget, be a very interesting adaptation, and I'm kind of surprised. You think you're like, Clive Barker wrote a really this is where the lore of this story, I feel like, especially as you get the revelation of said mystery in that third act here, it was a lot more interesting than the actual execution, which is, it's very gothically dialogue heavy, which is what I love so much about Clive when he really, really goes for it. And he does in this, but it is a lot of discussion and exposition, and it's not until you really peel back said layer of Iron Curtain or whatever that you start to really kind of realize the full grasp of the mythology that he was putting together here, which I really appreciate. But it just took a little bit more time, despite enjoying it and feeling the payoff at the end. It's as I'm working backwards in this particular anthology, I didn't like it as much as Jerusalem Street and our return to said character of the boy. And then we get to how spoilers bleed. And so this is a story where Clive is examining kind of that manifest destiny sort of thing, like how you had obviously here in North America, and even, back to Britain, and the fact that, they were just, taking land in everywhere from South Africa to, even from the natives initially, with the American colonies and stuff like that. But this story takes place in South America, what would have been considered present day back then in the 80s, but it's about these guys who basically, they're like, we purchased this land and, we own this area of South America. And it doesn't really delve too much into what their intention for purchasing said land is, but you can tell that there is reasoning behind it. There is an acquisition sort of project, and, whether they're trying to develop the area or whatever. But what it really boils down to is the fact that one of the kids from this local tribe, the white dudes, there's a German, there's a Brit, there's an American, whatever, and they're talking about, yeah, we bought this land fair and square, and it's your government that sold it to us. And the kind of English-speaking younger kid who does some interpretation and translation and whatnot, he's like, we were here before the government. We are the indigenous people of this particular area. And it's a trigger-happy dude who accidentally kills a kid from this localized tribe, and that's where there is a shamanistic, curse sort of thing. And it's interesting how, many of our stories in this particular collection, or at least the first few, they all deal with, a infliction, some sort of, whether it's otherworldly or, otherwise, as we will get to with the final story, the first one in the collection, actually, my personal favorite. But, yeah, it's about, a disease-riddled sort of thing, and in this case, it's where, there was already talk at the beginning of this story about the fact that, there was a sickness that, some of their crew, their team, had caught, and there's a few guys that had actually died. And yet, it almost feels like it amplifies the aspect, and without getting into too many spoilers, there are certain areas of decomposition that start to afflict these particular people after they get cursed, following the death of said child. And there is backstabbing and that sort of, nastiness going down, but just to scratch yourself and have this huge gaping wound because your body is just so soft and porous or whatever. It reminded me a lot of a Tales from the Crypt episode that had it was Daltrey, I think, from The Who, was starring in it, and it was where he steals somebody's wife, and, he gets this sort of disease when he's in the jungle, and when he comes back, he is slowly starting to rot and decompose. That's actually, man, I want to revisit that episode, because that's one of the best Tales from the Crypt episodes ever, by the way. So, yeah, I was incredibly impressed with, how spoilers bleed, and, yeah, just Clive tackling something drastically different, you know, taking place in this rural, remote area of South America as opposed to being in his usual throes of like London or Manhattan or whatever. So yeah, but it's still not my favorite of the collection. And that is because the very first story is called The Life of Death. And this is the one that, as far as like all my notes and stuff like here go, this is where I was putting down the most just quotes and bits and pieces here and there. So Pearl, goodness, I forget the last name of the woman who actually read the audiobook, but she did a tremendous job in just giving sympathy, empathy, all that different stuff to our lead character. And that's because our lead character was like on the throes of death, as we find out. And the story is called The Life of Death, just to clarify and bring that back up. But so she had cancerous tumors in her body. She had to have her womb removed. And as you find out as the story is transpiring, yeah, it basically soured and ended her presumed long-term relationship because she couldn't, you know, bear children for said dude that she had spent, you know, a presumed lengthy amount of time with. And yet he's still kind of sending her, you know, notes and still like keeping in touch and whatnot. But so she was on the verge of death. And she basically is still like the walking wounded, and she is still almost like in a dreamlike sort of state. And she meets a mysterious man when she is walking around one particular day and still in the throes of trying to piece her life back together. And it's when she decides to randomly go and look at this church built in like the 1700s that it's a mausoleum to be specific. And it's being torn down, and yet there is a very heavy kind of police presence, and they're wearing like masks and gloves and all this different stuff. And it's because the crypt has some sort of diseasey sort of thing. And yeah, after our lead character decides to go back in there, you find out, and this is about where I have to draw the line because of the fact that, yeah, she goes in there and it's the whole curiosity thing. Her curiosity, once aroused, was not easily silenced. And just her interaction with this guy initially, where he's like, I've always liked, you know, these sort of places where the dead dwell, you know? He's like, I have this morbid sort of curiosity. And he's like, we cry for ourselves. The dead are past caring. And you know, he kind of floats the idea to her, thinking that it's going to gross her out or weird her out, but no, she's kind of into it, which is why she comes back to said site as they're continuing to excavate it, and she goes and, you know, starts hunting around, and, you know, sometimes there was wisdom in forgetting, and yet she can't forget, like, just based on the fact that, you know, she went and looked around in this place at one particular point, like, it scratched the itch only but for a moment, and so that's why she returns. And there's so many profound like little bits in this particular story, but every love story was at last the story of death. That's something that Clive says at one particular point. And it's as she is like randomly seeing this guy here and there, and also trying to get herself reacclimated to being back in the workplace, and how since she was on that verge of death, everybody is kind of treating her weird, you know, and especially as she tries to, like, you know, show exuberance and enthusiasm and all of this different stuff, and it's just like, it's not clicking with people. They still feel this weird, like, sorrowfulness for her, but it's as she rediscovers this place and continues going back, and in turn has things happening to her, and especially as she is also trying to figure out who this guy is, because you think you know who he is, and then you think differently, and then there is additional clarification, and that's where I'm specifically dancing around this, because you're trying to figure out if said guy who she is having these sort of interactions with is in fact who you suspect. And so it's one of the best parts about the story is the fact that it is it's very slow burn, you know, but it is a fascinating character examination, and it's my favorite from this particular volume, and probably in the contention for one of my favorites of all 6 books of Blood, because of the fact that it is this weird examination about death and demise and all of those different things, and seen through the lens of somebody who, you know, faced down that sort of fate and somehow survived, and in turn their life is, you know, it's taken some twists that they had not necessarily expected, and it's absolutely my favorite of this particular volume, and as just to double down, one of my absolute favorites of this 6th and final book of Blood, man. And so yeah, The Life of Death, my personal favorite. In close contention for second was How Spoilers Bleed. Twilight at the Towers, you know, could have been better, in all honesty. It just took its time to get there, and The Last Illusion will be spoken of specifically and much more in-depth along with Lost Souls for another day. And then, what a great way to finish it off, Clive, like, just with the proper bookending of the Book of Blood on Jerusalem Street, which was, in fact, adapted on 2 separate occasions. There was the Hulu film a couple years ago, and then sometime in the mid-2000s, I can't remember a specific year at this particular point, but the Book of Blood was previously adapted as well. So that is concluding this lengthy journey that has been both of these suckers, man. Bam! Yeah, it's been very cool getting properly acquainted with Clive's work, because the only stuff that I had previously read was Hellbound Heart and Scarlet Gospels, which you have right there, which is like the sequel of sorts, you know, and brings Harry D'Amour into the proceedings and does all kinds of cool stuff there. And then I've read lots of Clive Barker comic books, because he did a series of Hellraiser stuff that Cecil and Robert and myself covered on the channel, which was really fun and fascinating and whatnot. You know, seeing Cotton, you know, come back, and seeing the changing of the guard, female pinheads, all kinds of crazy stuff like that. It was really dope, but yeah, I'm thinking that it's either going to be Tap in the Vein, or it's going to be just jumping right into Damnation Game. If you guys have any thoughts about what I should cover next, yeah, please feel free in the spot below to give some insight into, you know, do you think I'm completely wrong about, you know, loving the introductory particular portion of this? You know, I don't know, the Towers one, man, I need to revisit it. You know, despite even just going back over it again today, I feel like there is a big, like, just grand sort of mythology there that I really want to tap back into, so to speak. But yeah, man, that is the end of the proceedings for the Books of Blood. I extend a grande gracias. I've been Jaime En Fuego. You can find me on all social media sectors like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, here on YouTube, and thing that I'm very excited to be covering next. So yes, Tuesday, Tower Tuesday, as I always called it, was always the Stephen King day, and it is still gonna remain that. But you know, I've read everything King, and I still have lots of great, awesome ideas, but I have a lot of other things, you know, in this particular time slot that I'm excited about. Most recently, it was discussing The Ruins by Scott Smith in a new Stephen King kind of curated section of sorts, which is called Stephen King horror recommended novels of sorts, and I just finished my second King recommendation, which is none other than this bad boy right here, Nick Cutter's The Troop. This, ironically enough, had a lot of body horror similarities in some ways to The Ruins, which you can find the review of here. It'll be linked in the end credits here. But this is another one that King said, the troop scared the hell out of me, and I couldn't put it down. This is old school horror at its best. The next thing that I am filming, as I'm kind of getting over the con crud after Mad Monster, unfortunately, but yeah, man, I'm very excited to do the second in the Stephen King recommended horror novels. And I know King loves, like, you know, older stuff, you know, very much so, you know, Dracula and everything, you know, as far as, like, classic, you know, Lovecraft and Poe and whatnot, but I was trying to look for more contemporary stuff, and that is going to be covered for the second installment with The Troop coming up very soon. So look for that sometime next month here in August. Very excited to be discussing this kick-ass book. And yes, there is more Clive coverage coming, as I mentioned, but I just haven't determined what the next step will be, whether it's going to be novels proper, or whether it's going to be, you know, discussion about Lost Souls and The Last Illusion, if it's going to be more D'Amour-centric, or, you know, there's just so much, and he has a lot of stuff brewing, which is pretty exciting. So look forward to that. More King coverage coming, obviously, and yes, humbled and honored to have all of y'all's presence here today. So I've been Fuego. Y'all have been Rad Status. Like, share, subscribe, you know the drill. And until the Wheel of Cock comes around once more, hasta luego, cinemigos, constant readers and viewers alike, say thank you. I'm hoping we have been well met today, and yes, I hope we share more of this palaver sooner rather than later. And until then, remember to stay scad, and in this case, yeah, read Clive B, Mr. Barker.